Rama, Rama, Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, 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 Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, 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 Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari, Hare Krishna, 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 Hari, 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 Rama, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Hari. Okay, devotees, Prednaya, we will read Prabhupada-lilamrita. Sichasmi Chitayam, Prabhupada-lilamrita. Haribol, Spasiba za Abshenia. Thank you for the association. Hare Krishna. Pore Dekahobe. And so on. Vishnu Priya. Haribol. Haribol Vishnu Priya. Jai Chaitanya Jivani. Or Shobhakishori Devidasi, Haribol. Okay. All right. Devotees. Okay. Right. All right, so we are reading from Srila Prabhupada-lilamrita. Srila Prabhupada is in he is in 26 Second Avenue, and the preaching is developing quite strongly. Yeah, so we're still in 1966, October the 13th. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastyachade Shatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkalpatarubhyascha kripas sindhubhyevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So devotees, October the 13th, 1966, the Village Voice, the newspaper, the local newspaper, the Village Voice, ran 4 large photographs of the love pageant rally. The article stated, quote, "The backbone of the celebration was the mantras, holy chants from the Sanskrit Bhagavad Gita, and for 3 hours it became like a boat on a sea of rhythmic chanting, led by 15 disciples of Bhaktivedanta Swami, who operates from a storefront on 2nd Avenue. The mantras ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of drums, flutes, and soda cap tambourines. October 18th. It was Sunday. And again, they went to Tompkins Square Park. Swamiji played the bongo as before, striking the drumhead deftly as ever, his nimble fingers creating drum rolls as he sat on the rug in the autumn afternoon. His authentic melodic voice recited the prayers to the previous spiritual masters, Bhaktivinoda, Gaur-Kishore, Bhaktisiddhanta, the centuries-old disciplic succession of which he was the living representative, now in the 1960s in this remote part of the world. He sang their names in duty, deference, and love as their servant. He sat surrounded by his American followers under the tall oak tree amid the maze-like fences of the park. And the same magic occurred. This time the hippies came by with more ease and familiarity. Allen Ginsberg came again, and 100 others gathered as Prabhupada loudly sang, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Of the hundreds who came by, some stayed briefly and then left. Some decided to listen and chant for a few minutes, or even the entire afternoon. And a few, very few, marked their encounter with the Swami as an unforgettable change in their lives. Bob Corrins was looking for the Swami. He was walking with his stylishly dressed wife and 2-year-old son, Eric. Bob was 26 years old and worked as a supervisor in the New York City Welfare Department. He had grown up in Washington, D.C., where he had met his wife. He had a full face and broad forehead, a clear voice, and steady eyes. Bob, after I graduated from George Washington University, I decided to go straight to what I thought was the heart of the material world, New York City, to seek out whatever was the highest truth. I ended up living around the corner from the first East Village head shop, means hippie shop, unquote. Bob didn't think his job as a social worker really helped anyone. His clients over the years seemed to maintain their same outlook and habits. He and his wife frequented West Village coffee houses, had attended lectures by Leary and Alpert on expanded consciousness, and had taken part in a recent peace march. Bob had come to feel that his aspirations for a master's degree and a better apartment were unfulfilling, and he was looking for something more. Bob, I heard about the I Ching, a book that was supposed to chart a person's course in life. So I got someone to do a reading for me. The direction was, push upward through darkness. I took it as a good sign, a spiritual sign. Then I purchased the East Village Other, and I saw the article entitled Save Earth now. There was a picture of the Swami. I had read in a book by a Sikh teacher that there could be no higher knowledge without a spiritual master. Unquote. Every morning on his way to work, Bob used to pass by the Swami's storefront. Curious, he stopped once and peered in the window, only to find an empty room with some straw mats on the floor and one of the Swamiji's boys. Oh, these people are Buddhists, he thought. The door had been open, and the boy came over and invited him in. No thanks, he said, thinking, I don't want anything to do with Buddhism. And he went on to his job. In a head shop one day, he had picked up one of the Swami's Bhagavatams and looked through it. But he thought it was too advanced, so he put it back down. After he read the article in the East Village Other, his interest increased. He thought that today might be the last Sunday of chanting in the park before the cold weather came. And so he went to the park, hoping to find the Swami and his chanters. His wife was beside him, pushing Eric in a stroller, when he heard the ching-ching of the hand cymbals and a chorus of rhythmic chanting from the south side of the park. Thinking it must be the Swami, he followed the sound while his wife took Eric to play on the swings. Alone now, Bob drew closer, moving into the crowd until he could see the kirtan party and the Swami sitting under the tree. Bob stood among a crowd of hundreds, unnoticed. Everything is happening because of me, thought 19-year-old Julie Koslovsky. Everything I see is my own creation, and I am the supreme. Everything is mine. Oh, Krishna. Shoo. The madness, the madness. As the thought of being God obsessed her, Judy forgot her father and everything else. She was confused. If I am God, why can't I control everything? And why am I so fearful on LSD? Judy was a student at the City College of New York, majoring in art and history. She was taking guitar lessons from the Reverend Gary Davis, the blues singer and Christian preacher, who was teaching her the art of sad soul music. Today, however, under the influence of LSD, she had the overwhelming impression that she was God. She'd had a fight with her father, who seemed cold and distant to her and couldn't understand her, and she had left her parents' home in the Bronx and traveled downtown. She was going to visit a girlfriend, and Tompkins Square Park happened to be on the way. When she reached the park, the kirtan was going on, but she couldn't see much because of the crowd. She weaved her way in closer until she could see some men, one shaven-headed, several bearded, dancing with upraised hands. And in the center, she saw the Swami sitting on the rug, playing his drum. Dan Clark was 25, thin, intense, horn-rimmed bespectacled, an avant-garde filmmaker. And his first film was entitled Rebirth. He was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War and was working at a home for children as alternative governmental service. He had been a member of the SDS and the War Resisters League. He had been arrested during a protest demonstration, and he had been suspended 1 week from his job for wearing a peace button and a black armband. He was into Buddhism, but he had lately been adding a little psychedelic seasoning. Everything is nothing and nothing is everything was his slogan. And he would go around chanting it like a mantra. But he was feeling that, at least psychologically, he needed a devotional tonic. His voidistic meditation was getting stale. Dan had come to the park today looking for the Swami and the chanting he had read about in the East Village Other. He had seen the Swami before, one evening a few months back. He had been waiting for a bus across the street from the Swami's storefront. He was on the way to a rehearsal for a mixed media show, and his friend had gone into Sam's luncheonette for a moment, when he noticed that in the storefront, an orange-robed Indian man with a shaved head was lecturing to a small group of people. Dan. When I saw him, I imagined myself walking across the street, going into the storefront, sitting down, and renouncing all worldly connections. But I thought to myself, it's only my imagination. After all, I'm married, and I'm on my way to rehearsal, and I don't know anything about the Swami anyway. So my friend and I got on the bus. But Dan lived only a few blocks away from the storefront, and now and then he would pass by. Once he had stood for several minutes on the sidewalk, looking at the cover of the Srimad Bhagavatam taped onto the window. Dan. It showed an oval lotus with planets around it. And right then I was introduced to the idea of spiritual sensuality. And when I saw the painting of Lord Chaitanya and his associates in the window, that really threw me. I thought, yes, this is what I need, juice. Dan and his wife walked the paved pathway through the park. He was looking around for the Swami, but he didn't really know what to look for. He expected to see robes and hear Buddhist-style chanting, but he couldn't find anything. He had given up his search and was wandering around to see what musicians were there, when he noticed a big crowd gathered around what he figured must have been some musicians. He was attracted by the beat of their music, a chiming 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, a simple rhythm with a kind of flamboyance and very magnetic. He saw an occasional upraised arm above the crowd, and he thought there must be flamenco dancing going on inside the circle. He then got wind of a drifting melody, certainly not flamenco, which accompanied the beat, and this attracted him further. He approached closer and closer, making his way through the crowd. Then he saw people chanting and others dancing and waving their arms in what he took to be a blend of American Indian and Asian dancing. It looked like something from a long-forgotten era. Dan decided that this must be the Hare Krishna group, but there were no robes, just the regular dress of the Lower East Side. And where was the Swami? Then he saw him sitting, inconspicuous, playing a little drum. His eyes were closed, and his brow was knit with concentration. Dan, the Swami, wasn't calling attention to himself, and at first I didn't attribute any importance to an elderly Indian man sitting off to one side. He didn't seem to have any special function in the chanting, but it gradually dawned on me who he was. He was the same Swami I had read about in the paper and seen in the storefront. After a while he spoke, but I couldn't hear him. Still, I was impressed that he was a very modest person, not interested in getting himself up on a pedestal. He didn't go strutting around, but was still with inner peace, strength, and knowledge. Bob, all his disciples were there around his feet. They were chanting, and I tried to chant along and learn the mantra too. I had heard the chanting of Hare Krishna once before at a peace march, and I had found it very beautiful. Then the Swami spoke. I had the impression that this person was not earthly, and I thought, here's the person I'm looking for. He seemed to be different from anyone else, like he came from some other place or universe. I was attracted. After a second kirtan, the Swami and his followers rolled up their rug, picked up their instruments, and began to leave. Bob walked back to the swings on the other side of the park to find his wife and child, but the image of the Swami stayed with him. He seemed different from anyone else. His accent had been thick, yet Bob resolved to go to the storefront in a few days to hear him speak. Here is a leader, thought Bob. Dan and his wife sauntered off into the park, sampling the various groups of musicians. His wife was surprised that Dan, who was usually shy, had danced at the kirtan. He said he might go over to the storefront one day and hear the Swami speak. Judy just stood there hallucinating. She held a Stay High Forever pamphlet in her hand and read it over and over and over. While she was thinking the whole event must have come from another planet, a man walked up and asked, "Would you like to go to where the Swami is?" She nodded. At the storefront, one of the devotees offered Judy some prasadam, a chapati. Okay. And then invited her up to the Swami's room. Upstairs, she entered the large front room, which was filled with fragrant smoke. There were tall flower vases, and sesame seeds were on the floor. She saw the Swami bow before the little picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, and then stand and leave the room, closing the door behind him. Judy decided that he must have been bowing to the floor itself. Around her, everyone was softly chanting on beads, and although she couldn't make out the words, it seemed peaceful. One of the Swami's disciples told her she could come into the back room, and she followed, curious. The Swami was sitting there on his mat, looking effulgent. There were about 10 other people in the room. Prabhupada asked her if she liked the chanting in the park, and she replied, "I loved it." "Do you live near here?" he asked. Judy flashed on her idea that she was the all-pervading truth and answered in a way which she thought must have sounded very mystical. "Oh, I live very near." Good, said Swamiji. Then you can come for our morning kirtan in class. Then she realized that she didn't live so near and that it would mean traveling an hour and a half from the Bronx to visit the Swami. But she decided that since he had asked her, she would come. Then she thought, I'm making this up. But Prabhupada assured her, as if knowing her thoughts, this process is nothing you have made up. It is very old, very simple, and sublime. He leaned back. We are eternal, he said, and everything around us is temporary. Judy was now coming down from the LSD. By the time she left the Swami, it was late. She had wanted to stay overnight, but the boys hadn't allowed her. But she was determined to join. For Bob, it seemed natural to follow up on what he had seen in the park. He began attending the evening classes, and he started reading the Bhagavatam at home and chanting. He framed the picture from the Bhagavatam dust jacket depicting the spiritual sky and placed it on his small homemade altar. He would offer flowers before the picture and sit before it, chanting Hare Krishna. Bob was fascinated by the philosophy and the books and classes, and from the very beginning he was amazed that Swamiji's teachings answered all his questions. He listened carefully and accepted. It seemed like once I'd decided that he was telling the truth, I just accepted everything he said. Not that part of it was the truth, and the rest of it I would have to think about. October 19th. It was Monday evening, after the Sunday kirtan in the park, and Dan arrived at the storefront for kirtan. The kirtan was in full swing, and when he entered, the first thing he noticed was some people playing on the innards of an upright piano leaning against the wall near the door. A boy handed him some wooden sticks, and he sat down and joined in the kirtan. Then came the Swami's lecture, which Dan thought was long and serious, about how sexual desire causes bondage and suffering. The temple was crowded and stuffy, and Dan was shocked by the lecture. But he stayed on because he knew there would be another kirtan. He felt uneasy that the Swami's followers were all celibate, but because he liked the kirtans, he resolved to keep coming. The Swami wasn't quite what Dan had expected. He had imagined something of a light-hearted Zen Roshi, laughing and joking, with sparkling eyes and words filled with paradoxes. But he found the Swami just the opposite, very straightforward and even cutting in his speech, and his mouth turned down at the corners, making him look mournful. Dan happily took to the kirtans, thinking they would aid his impersonal meditation, but the lectures kept stressing that God was a person. Dan resisted. He mentally debated with Prabhupada. He was partial to Dr. Radhakrishnan's interpretation of the Gita, and yet the Swami often launched ruthless attacks against such impersonal ideas. Wow, ruthless attacks. Gradually, Dan saw his impersonal barrier crumble, and he came to admit that on every count, the Swami was right. Judy began attending both the morning and evening classes. She had to rise by 5 o'clock to get to the storefront on time, and her mother and father protested. But Judy didn't care. She would ride an hour and a half on the subway before dawn, downtown to the Swami's meetings, where she would be the only girl present. When the Swami heard that Judy was an art student, he asked her to paint for Krishna. She set up a canvas in the front room of the apartment, and under his guidance, she began painting. For a first assignment, he asked her to paint a portrait of his Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He gave her a photo and instructed her. There should be a flower garland around Guru Maharaj's neck. The tilak should be yellowish, not white. And there should be no effulgence or halo around his head. Bob, I began chanting and studying the Srimad Bhagavatam at home and attending the kirtan and classes at the storefront. After the last kirtan in the evening, the Swami would take a bowl made of simulated wood and a little paring knife and a couple of apples that had been sitting on the edge of his lectern, and he would cut the apples up in the little bowl and hand the bowl to a disciple. The disciple would then offer him the first piece, and he would pop it into his mouth. The rest of the pieces of apple would be distributed to the crowd. I remember one time when he was chewing on his piece of apple and he spat the seeds out on the floor up against the wall. They bounced off the wall onto the floor next to the dais. And I was thinking, how wonderful. No one else can do that. No one else would have the nerve to do such a thing. Ah, Krishna. With his aesthetic filmmaker's eye, Dan appreciated Swamiji's manner. Dan, there was a sink right next to the dais where he sat. It was so close that he could have leaned over and touched it. After cutting up an apple, he would take the scraps and just fling them into the sink. It was very casual. I was impressed by that. And one time, Brahmananda came up and wanted 50 cents for something, and the Swami reached down and picked up his little black purse, the kind that closes by a metal clasp at the top. He snapped it open, looked inside very perspicaciously, and then his hand came up like a bird, like an eagle, hovering in flight above its prey. But the hand didn't pounce. It just delicately drifted down, took out a 50-cent piece, and rose up again, as if it were being lifted up on a balloon. It was graceful. It was a dance, a ballet. He just picked up this 50-cent piece and lifted it into Brahmananda's hand. I couldn't believe it. Someone asks you for a 50-cent piece. You just dig in your pockets and throw it at them. But the Swami seemed to treat everything as Krishna's property, and this 50-cent piece was treated with such care. The weeks went by. Some of the devotees had spoken to Bob about initiation, but he was unsure. He didn't know exactly what initiation was, but it seemed to him that the other devotees were eager to get him initiated because he was working and had a family. To Bob's way of thinking, he represented maturity to them, a middle-class American. and they were eager to land him. Bob's wife wasn't interested, and his friends were downright opposed. He couldn't spend much time with Prabhupada or the devotees, since he was either at the office or at home with his family. Bob. So they were asking me if I was interested in initiation. I said I would think about it. I hadn't stopped smoking. I hadn't made the final decision. The first real personal exchange I had with the Swami was when I asked for initiation. The rest of the time I was so much in awe of him that it didn't occur to me to say anything. I always wanted to. I felt puffed up, and I always thought, well, I should be able to talk to him. Maybe I should do something. But I was always kind of reluctant to do it. I didn't think it was my place. I guess maybe I was afraid. But I was getting up early and chanting 32 rounds a day, many of them on the subway. I was afraid of the material world because I didn't have much association with devotees, and I wanted to insulate myself by chanting more. Judy was another person who was considering initiation. And I asked her what she was going to do about it, and she said, I'm thinking about it. And then she told me she had decided she would get initiated and give up all her bad habits. I began to think maybe I could give up these things too. So I asked what to do. How do I approach him? And Kirtanananda said, well, you go up to his room. I was surprised it was so easy. I had prepared a little speech in my mind. My dear Swamiji, would you kindly accept me as your disciple and teach me about Krishna consciousness? I went up to his room without an appointment and knocked on the door. I heard him say, come in. I entered the room, and he was sitting behind his desk. He was alone. I made obeisances, and he looked at me and said, yes? And I said, Swamiji, will you make me your disciple? And that's as far as I got. I was going to say, and teach me the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but he didn't let me finish my speech. He said, yes. It was so simple. I thought, well, there's nothing else to say. He's accepted me. So I thanked him and paid my obeisances and left. Unquote. You know you're not supposed to be up here unless you're initiated, Achyutananda said. Judy was flustered. She had come upstairs to put some dirty pots in the kitchen. Oh yes, she replied. That's just what I wanted to talk to Swamiji about. And she went into Prabhupada's room where he was talking with a few other people. Swamiji, could I please get initiated? She asked. And he said, do you know the 4 rules? Yes. Can you follow them? Yes. Then you can be initiated in 2 weeks. Dan was also thinking about initiation, but he wanted to wait. He was chanting 16 rounds and attending all the classes, despite his reluctant wife. He'd always had difficulty with authority figures, but he could feel that the Swami was winning him over and wearing down his impersonal barrier. 2 weeks later, Prabhupada held another initiation ceremony. Bob became Rupanuga, and Judy became Jadurani. Dan needed a little more time. So now chapter 21 beyond the lower east side. So little introduction, so it's a whole new chapter. Little introduction from Brahmananda. But we were shocked that he was going to leave. I never thought that Krishna consciousness would go beyond the Lower East Side, what to speak of New York City. I thought that this was it, and it would stay here eternally. Brahmananda. Hare Krishna was becoming popular. Regular kirtans in the park, newspaper coverage. Hayagriva called it the Hare Krishna explosion. The Lower East Side hippies considered the chanting of Hare Krishna one of the, quote-unquote, one of the grooviest things happening, and that the Swami's disciples didn't take LSD, didn't seem to affect their popularity. The devotees were accepted as angelic people, carrying the peaceful chanting to others and offering free food and a free place to stay. You could get the most interesting vegetarian food free at their place if you went at the right time. And in the storefront on the shelf by the door were books from India. In the clubs, local musicians played the melody that they'd picked up from the Swami when he chanted in the park and at the temple. The Lower East Side was a neighborhood of artists and musicians, and now it was also the neighborhood of Hare Krishna. Burton Green. Musicians were influenced by it, the Krishna chant, Govinda Jaya Jaya, and other chants. I used some of those chants when I recorded. A lot of musicians reached out for this in different ways. We would explode in a short time and blow off, but then keep the chant underneath as a basis. A lot of people found that spiritual vibration, even in the midst of the heavy music they were doing. They were becoming devotee musicians. Unquote. Evening kirtans were always big. Brahmananda used to stand by the back door every night and watch the room fill up until there was no place left to sit. There was a lot of interest in the group chanting and music making. But after the kirtan, when the talk was to begin, people would start to leave. It was not uncommon for half the audience to leave before the talk began. And sometimes people would leave in the middle of the lecture. One evening, Allen Ginsberg brought Ed Sanders and Tuli Kupferberg of the Fugs to the meeting. The Fugs, a local group that had made a name for themselves, specialized in obscene lyrics. Among the popular songs of Ed Sanders were Slum Goddess of the Lower East Side, Group Grope, and I Can't Get High. Ed had wild red hair and an electric red beard, and he played a guitar during the kirtan. The devotees were happy to see their prestigious guests. The night of the Fugs, however, Prabhupada chose to speak on the illusion of sexual pleasure. Quote, sex pleasure binds us to this material world, birth after birth, he said. And he quoted, as he often did, a verse of Yamunacharya. Since I've become Krishna conscious, whenever I think of sex life with a woman, My face at once turns from it, and I spit at the thought, unquote. The thugs never returned. To speak ill of sexual pleasure was certainly not a strategic move for one who wanted to create followers among the Lower East Side hippies. But Prabhupada never considered changing his message. In fact, when Umapati had mentioned that Americans didn't like to hear that sex was only for conceiving children, Prabhupada had replied, I cannot change the philosophy to please the Americans. What about sex? Asked the ISKCON attorney, Steve Goldsmith, one evening, speaking out from the rear of the crowded temple. Sex should only be with one's wife, Prabhupada said, and that is also restricted. Sex is for the propagation of Krishna-conscious children. My spiritual master used to say that to beget Krishna-conscious children, he was prepared to have sex 100 times. Of course, that is most difficult in this age. Therefore, he remained a brahmachari. But sex is a very strong force, Mr. Goldsmith challenged. What a man feels for a woman is undeniable. Therefore, in every culture, there's the institution of marriage, Prabhupada replied. You can get yourself married and live peacefully with one woman, but the wife should not be used as a machine for sense gratification. Sex should be restricted to once a month and only for the propagation of children. Hayagriva, who was seated just to Swamiji's left, beside the large dangling symbol, spoke out suddenly. Only once a month? And with a touch of facetious humor, he added loudly, better to forget the whole thing. Yes, that's it. Very good boy, Swamiji laughed, and others joined him. It is best not to think of it. Best just to chant Hare Krishna. And he held up his hands as if he was chanting on a strand of beads. That way we'll be saved from so much botheration. Sex is like the itching sensation, that's all. And as when we scratch, it gets worse. So we should tolerate the itching and ask Krishna to help us. It is not easy. Sex is the highest pleasure in the material world, and it is also the greatest bondage. But Steve Goldsmith was shaking his head. Prabhupada looked at him smiling. There's still a problem? He said, it's just that, well, it's been proved dangerous to repress the sex drive. That's a theory that we have wars because, he got cut off. People are eating meat, Prabhupada interrupted. And as long as people eat meat, there'll be war. And if a man eats meat, he'll be sure to have illicit sex also. Steve Goldsmith was an influential friend and supporter of ISKCON, but Prabhupada would not change the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, quote unquote, to please the Americans. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Krishna, Krishna.